Hey, Women in Crime listeners. This is Patrick Hines from True Crime Obsessed Podcast, and I'm so excited to tell you that I'm launching a brand new true crime comedy podcast called Obsessed with Disappeared. The podcast is an episode-by-episode recap of everyone's favorite true crime show, ID's Disappeared. So if you're as fascinated and terrified as I am by missing persons cases, this podcast is for you. My co-host for Obsessed with Disappeared is my best friend of 20 years, Broadway diva Ellen Marsh. Our podcast is full of humor, sass, heart, and also 2 decades worth of just the shadiest dirt on each other. So if you're serious about true crime and missing people, but you also love to laugh, find Obsessed with Disappeared wherever you get your podcasts. Episodes 1 and 2 are available right now.
This podcast may contain content that is graphic and disturbing in nature. Listener discretion is advised. As the country faces a crisis in race and justice, the cases we discuss today have helped bring our attention to some of the most significant injustices and important issues. But what can we actually do about it? This is episode 19, Race and Crime in America.
Megan, we have some new patrons. Actually, we have 2 former students.
I saw that, so I'm excited about all of them,
Yes.
but the 2 former students, that was so
I
cool.
know.
All right, so shout outs to...
Special shout out to Megan Gelnick. Hi, Megan. I had Megan in intro when she was a freshman.
I've had Megan in several of my classes, and she is just such an outstanding student, and she was so positive. She always brought something special to my classroom, so thank you, Megan.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Megan. And we have Rose.
Rose Weston, I know. I saw Rose too. I've had Rose also several times, and I can tell you that she is a serious academic, and Rose was already at a graduate level at the undergraduate, and she elevated all of my classes as well. So these are 2 really accomplished students.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much.
Coming back to take care of their old professors.
Right? So nice.
Thank you,
and
ladies.
Rose had a question, I believe, right, Megan?
So Rose did have a question which related to my Women in Crime class. So she said that she didn't recall learning about the issues that female juveniles go through or the crimes they're likely to get involved with. So are their needs and crimes the same as adult women? Are female juveniles tried as adults at the same rate as male juveniles for the same crimes? And what kind of services and policies would need to be implemented to aid female juveniles who are offenders that differ from adult women? So multi-part question. I did briefly cover this, but I can tell you that historically females were tried for different types of offenses, more often for those status offenses where they were looked at as like bad girls breaking the rules. And that still holds true. They are now tried more for some of the crimes that males are, but they're also tried more for aggressive female crimes, like, historically they weren't tried for simple assaults, but yes, now they are. It's like zero tolerance. We're going to try you for the same things that we're going to try males as. So I would say females are still tried more often for status offenses.
Is that also a function of a change in domestic violence laws?
Yes, absolutely. So when it used to be, it's mandatory arrest for all parties now. And so that's why both adult females and juvenile females are tried more often for these offenses that historically they were never tried for. Are their needs different than males? Yes, because they do mirror the adult female population. And in the adult female population, in prisons and in the system, we know that they suffer much more extensive physical, sexual abuse and mental health issues and often dependency issues. So there are definitely those same needs. Are they tried as often for adult crimes as males? No, but that's probably because there are also less of them. They're not typically held or they're not the typical offenders. Males are still perpetrating those more serious crimes more frequently. And finally, what kind of services and policies would need to aid female juveniles?
That could be a whole class.
That could be an absolute whole class. I'm going to have to say that it's not going to be so much different than adult females. They really need strong mental health counseling and they probably need substance abuse counseling as well, strong education. So probably a lot of the same things that the adult females need, but it goes, earlier prevention will help later on. So thank you for your question, Rose, and I hope we answered it.
Thank you. I also want to say hello and thank you to Ali Brigante.
From San Clemente, James says that's a dream town to live in.
Sounds fabulous. And a thank you to Katie Price. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie. Let's see. We have Jody Durr, who's in the Coast Guard.
Oh, thank you so much for your service.
Right? Thank you, Jody. And she also wrote in with a question.
What led you to having an interest and choosing a career in criminology? And are there any cases you've studied that have always stuck with you? All right, I'll go first. So for me, I've just always been interested in psychology. I've always been interested in social justice issues. So I think for me, being interested in psychology and social justice issues, it just seemed like a natural fit to be interested in criminology. And I did study forensic psychology for a while, so that's kind of that bridge as well. I have a lot of cases that stick with me. For me, I would say it has to be death row exonerees, specific cases. But in general, when people are wrongfully convicted, of course, that's the most egregious miscarriage of justice. But on top of that, to sentence someone to death for something they didn't do, it's just, I never stopped thinking about those cases.
So I was interested in criminal law at a young age, actually very young age, from watching bad television with my mom, watching LA Law. And it stuck with me forever, but my interest just kind of morphed after I worked in a criminal law firm, or I didn't work in a criminal law firm, I worked in a civil one, and I just wasn't that interested in becoming a lawyer. But I was interested in the field, so I kind of stuck with it and pursued my education and careers in the field of criminal justice. There are a million cases that have stuck with me. I obsess over John Bonet still all the time because I just need to know who did it.
The brother.
I seriously, I don't know, but I do obsess over that one. Because we spent so much time on direct appeal, I am still obsessed with Melanie McGuire and finding out the actual truth of what happened. And very much obsessed as well with, or the one that sticks with me, Darlie Roudier, because she's on death row and I really feel that she's innocent. So thank you for your question, Jody, and thank you for your service.
And lastly, we have a fellow Jersey girl, Mary D.
Thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Mary. Mary had a question, right?
Here's Mary's question. Since you are both immersed in the crime world as criminologists and creating crime content, does it ever get emotionally or mentally too much? Do you ever need to take a step back away from crime? In general, I don't need to because I think I am so passionate, but there are certain cases that bother me. So we just covered Shanda Sharer, and I had nightmares about Shanda, and it really, truly bothered me, upset me. I pretty much was crying when I was writing that, and I'm not a crier or sensitive. There are times where people will also talk to me about their crimes and how they feel about them and the genuine remorse they feel and how upset you could see what they've done to themselves and ruined their lives and the consequences they feel. And I do feel badly at times. So there are times for sure when I get emotional, but I would never step away from this passion.
Yeah. So for me, creating the episodes, I can somehow distance myself from it. And I don't ever feel like I need to take a step away from it. However, working in prison, similar to what you were alluding to, there's been several times that I drive home from teaching inside crying because it's just, you meet some of the kindest people who are probably going to die in prison. So yeah, just being in our criminal justice system, to me, that's the difficult part.
So thank you so much to our new patrons. Today's episode is different. It is a special one for us in which we are going to tackle race and crime using cases, mostly focusing on females here because that is what we do on Women in Crime, but using these individual stories in this episode to illustrate some of the problems and some of the solutions of racism in our criminal justice system. Amy is particularly suited to lead this episode today, given that she teaches race and crime and other related courses. We've both received a number of emails and comments asking about this current crisis, though. And maybe, Amy, you can start by giving us sort of the background or a brief overview of the history of race in the U.S. system.
Great. So before I get there, I just want to say that we'd like to use this episode as an opportunity to have a meaningful discussion on race and crime in America. Before we get to the cases, though, and discuss the things that we can practically do to try and improve the system, we'd like to touch briefly on the issues that have plagued the Black community historically. Because, Megan, as you know, this issue is not limited to the criminal justice system. Racism has been a systemic feature of American society since its inception. So when we talk about systemic racism, what we're talking about is racism that infects the very structure of our society. And really, that's present in all facets of our society.
I think that's true, Amy. Sorry, before you get into it, I think one of the things that when we lay the foundation in our classes is that we also try to start, even though we specialize in the criminal justice system, we try to start by laying the foundation and explaining how, like a sociological point of view, how is this present in the other social structures of our system?
Yes, and I always say, really, you can't teach about the criminal justice system without addressing race.
You can't.
I can't imagine any criminologist does. So we know in education we see a disparity. For example, school curriculum claims to be inclusive and representative. However, despite, of course, some positive changes, research shows us that the perspective is often white and middle class and tends to ignore historical and current power imbalances. And also not to mention the disproportionate way that Black children are treated in school.
What do you mean by that?
Black children are, for example, 3 times more likely to be suspended. And not only are we suspending these children, we're suspending them for minor infractions that non-Black children would not have the same punitive reactions to.
Okay, thank you.
We can also look to healthcare and housing discrimination. We could look to wealth and employment gaps as an example. White families, we know, hold 90% of the nation's wealth. And the unemployment rate consistently is extremely higher for Black people. So while we can spend several episodes talking about all of the disparities in all of these areas, of course, we're going to focus on our criminal justice system. The United States, in effect, operates 2 distinct criminal justice systems, one for wealthy people and another for poor people and people of color. Megan, have you read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow?
Of course I have it, but I have not read the whole thing yet.
Okay, well, I'm sure you will be reading it. I always see it on your bookshelf. So
I know.
So I really encourage everyone to read this book. I make my students read it. I have made my students read this book since the book first came out because it is such an important read. It really focuses on systemic racism, arguing that it's embedded in our criminal justice system and, of course, other government policies. But it really has been around since the civil rights movement. And essentially, Michelle Alexander argues that, as the title suggests, mass incarceration really serves the same purpose as slavery once did and then Jim Crow laws did as well. Of course, the result has been millions of Black Americans who are behind bars and denied the very rights that they fought so hard for during the civil rights movement.
Thank you. I know that book's a great one. And I know that at the end of this episode, I think we have some other recommended readings and documentaries for people who are going to be interested in going further with this.
Yes, we definitely do. But everyone, your homework is to first read The New Jim Crow.
Got it.
Okay. All right. So as white Americans, I don't know about you, Megan, but I don't usually feel the need to worry about being monitored by the police.
I've never really worried about that either.
Nope.
But especially because I was a probation officer too. So I was on the opposite end in some ways.
But unfortunately, the day-to-day reality for Black people is quite different. And we know this because we talk to our non-white students. And I love teaching race and crime because I love hearing the reality of everyday life from these students. We know Black people are more likely to be stopped by the police than any other race. And we're talking both traffic stops and street stops. Police are also more likely to threaten non-white people and to use force. Now, we know that some police tactics are more discriminatory than others. For example, Megan, you know about stop and frisk, I'm sure.
I do know about stop and frisk. That is when a police officer can stop someone who they are suspicious of looking dangerous and maybe have committed a crime, and they are allowed an outer clothing pat-down. Not a full-on search, but an outer clothing pat-down.
Yeah, and just to extend on that, it's supposed to be non-intrusive, but talk to any Black person who has been at the other end of one of these stop and frisks. I don't think any of them will tell you that it is non-intrusive. So, Megan, as we teach in our classes, right, Terry versus Ohio is when the Supreme Court said that individuals can be stopped based on reasonable suspicion. And as we know, that is extremely subjective. And that's when the issues come in, right?
The issue is subjective. Terry v. Ohio, just for people who know, is 1968. And it was an off-duty police officer who observed people who were actually casing a jewelry store and possessed weapons. And so, you know, he stopped them and he made kind of a frisk, and he did find firearms. And the court said, okay, what he did wasn't technically a violation of Fourth Amendment, but I've heard them. This is hotly debated. And let me just also say that in one of my books, I can't remember if it's the Corrections or the Intro to Criminal Justice one, I did a section on stop and frisk, and when I went to all these oral histories and narratives, and I read some of the most devastating stop and frisks, you don't think much of it. You think it's